All right, so it's the spring, early summer 2000, and you're a Nintendo fan. And everybody else is talking about their PlayStations. The PlayStation 2 is on the horizon. People are talking about the Dreamcast, whether it's going to make it or not. But you're happy. You've got a Nintendo 64. You've been playing the greatest games of a generation. Super Mario 64, Banjo Kazooie, GoldenEye, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And in 1999, Pokemon, which had come out the previous year, Pokemon took the world by storm. Pokemon Red, Blue, Yellow was out. Pinball, Snap, Stadium just came out. Pokemon was everywhere, everything you could ever want as a Nintendo fan, and if you were like 8 or 9 or 10 years old. And so as a kid, obviously Nintendo Power was my source of news. At this point in my life, I had access to the internet. Obviously my parents weren't like saying, hey, go get on the internet for fun. And I kind of knew about it. We had a computer that sat in the corner of our kind of dining room area. It's funny. Houses now, we build houses or an apartment or whatever. There's the place where the computer goes, the hookups and everything's there. Back in the 90s, when computers became a big thing, you kind of had to decide, okay, where are we going to put these things? If these things are going to be part of our, home forever. So my home growing up, at least for us, like we just kind of had to shove the computer in a room or in a corner on a desk that was meant for sitting down and writing letters or filling out envelopes and paying bills. But then all of a sudden this giant Acer computer sat down on it. So in the late 90s, literally earliest of 2000s, we were I was not online. I don't think most kids were online. Plenty of people were getting their video game news from the internet at this point. The IGN was a website that, in the 1996 with N64.com. So people were on the internet. But for me, again, I was waiting for Nintendo Power to show up in the mail. So I was what Nintendo wanted every customer to be. I only got my news from Nintendo Power. I didn't believe rumors. I didn't read websites that were reporting things before Nintendo wanted them to report things. It wasn't like this, internet, the internet websites and stuff at the time. There were people who were getting stuff from Japan and printing it or putting it on, their websites. Nintendo Power was this kind of propaganda machine where you only read what Nintendo wanted you to read. It was the definition of state-run media. It was the early version of Nintendo Directs. It was the early version of social media from these companies. Nintendo Power directly, as Awada did in the videos, was giving the information directly to us. So E3 2000 comes around, and I was expecting a pretty big year. Even though everybody knew the N64 was on its last leg, for me as a kid, I thought the N64 was going to be around forever. EGM, GamePro were talking about Nintendo 2000. Remember last time we talked about how the Dolphin was announced at E3 99? But I wasn't thinking about the Dolphin. I didn't want to think about a new system. I love my Nintendo 64, and I had so many games for it, and I couldn't wait to get more. And everybody kind of had this idea that, okay, this is going to be a big E3 for Rare because Banjo-Kazooie came out 1998. Banjo-Tooie was teased at the end of Banjo-Kazooie. Banjo-Tooie must be coming out this fall. And in hindsight, or knowing what I know now, Rare announced Banjo-Tooie like in late December, like officially announced it on their website. They posted a screenshot on New Year's Day on their website. But I didn't know that. I just had Nintendo Power, so I was just getting what they told me. So I knew that Banjo-Tooie had to be around the corner, and also Conker 64. I'm going to do a whole other video on this, but Conker 64 had been this long awaited project, announced in 1997, re-revealed in 1998, went off the grid in 1999, and as a kid, those felt, that's a long time anyway, but that felt like a forever amount of time. So was Conker going to show back up? And in late 99, 12 Tales Conker disappeared from the future releases in Nintendo Power, and it showed back up with a new name, Conker's Bad Fur Day, right up, leading up to E3 2000. So I was expecting Conker. A lot of other stuff was hopefully on the horizon. So first, we're going to look at the May issue of Nintendo Power from 2000, and it's going to give us kind of the overview of what to expect from this E3. And right off the bat, we get this picture of Link with a Goron mask, and we get the idea that, okay, this is going to be a big Zelda year again. So Ocarina of Time came out in 98. The 1 year Zelda game, not quite 1 year, but they started working on it probably a few months after Ocarina. Hey, we're going to get this game out the next year. 2000, it was going to be the big holiday game, launching up right alongside the PlayStation 2. So we see Kid Link with a Goron mask. We see Kid Link with a Goron mask, and then we see a screenshot. There it is, Banjo Tooie. And he looks like he's being attacked by, or maybe going to enter inside of that dinosaur. We'll find out, obviously, in the game that he can turn into a dinosaur. But we also see Zelda for the Game Boy Color that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then we have a Perfect Dark. It's really odd that they chose, of the games they chose to put on the first page here, you have Majora's Mask. No screenshots, but Majora's Mask, you have Banjo Tooie, you have Zelda GBC, and then you have Perfect Dark GBC. And I was like, okay, yeah, I guess that's a big game. And then we have these interviews. They did these really neat things, weird things, kind of lame things, I guess, in this E3 spread, where they were interviewing the characters and getting responses from in the character's voice. So here's Mario saying, "Hey, Paper Mario Story's about done." So Paper Mario Story, which would become Paper Mario, had been through a couple of names already. It was originally Super Mario RPG 2, it became Mario Adventure, Paper Mario Story, and then finally Paper Mario. And I bet they probably backed away from Paper Mario Story because Yoshi's Story, not the biggest hit in America, and I think that's actually what it's called in Japanese. I think it's called Paper Mario Story, and it's the whole book thing. So of course that makes sense. And he even acknowledges, hey, people have been calling this Super Mario RPG 2, but it's more than that. So and Mario Tennis was about to come out, and then there's he references Isabella, which is, Animal Crossing. No, that's just a little thing they're doing. Alrighty, so Pokemon. We talked about Pokemon being big. So in 2000, the big game coming up with Pokemon Gold and Silver. So we see a screenshot of Totodile, Ledova, Centret, Chikorita. It's gonna be in color, so that's a big deal. But we see the Pocket Pikachu. Kind of Tamagotchi device. This is how big Pokemon was. They're talking about the movie in the E3 spread. Like, what? That's nothing to do with E3. It was coming out that summer though. It was a big deal. So then we get into some screenshots of some of the games. We got Majora's Mask, which again they show this really weird angle of Link talking to one of the people in town, and then you can tell we're at the end of the N64 because Nintendo's not announcing anything at this E3. Now, we'll talk about some rare games, but there's no first-party Nintendo games other than Majora's Mask. So, if you weren't suspicious at this point, and as a reader, I'm like, Kirby's coming out, Mario Tennis is coming out, Majora's Mask is coming out, which they're just calling The Legend of Zelda Mask at this point. And then Paper Mario. So they weren't announcing. And usually E3, they announced a whole lot of games. Then there's a Banjo interview down here where we get a screenshot of the Mayan land from Banjo Tooie. Then on the next page, we get a spread about Game Boy Color. And it's like, hey, this system just isn't going to die. They acknowledge, hey, this is it was been around for a long time. The Game Boy Color, the Game Boy since '89, so even the Game Boy Color wasn't that old. It was still the same hardware. And we get this interview with Link, and we're told that there's 3 Game Boy Color games coming out that are part of this package. 3 elements of the Triforce: Power, Courage, and Wisdom. We know we only got 2 of those. One of them was supposed to be a remake of Zelda 1. That never happened, obviously. So Capcom tried to get 3 games out and they couldn't. So at the end of this issue in the Pack a Watch, there's the Zelda Unmasked where we get more details, more screenshots of Majora's Mask. So we clearly see that it's going to involve transformations. There's Zora Link, there's Goron Link, there's Young Link on Epona, which you can just tell this game's kind of a ROM hack of Ocarina of Time. It's like, oh, what couldn't we do in Ocarina of Time? Well, you couldn't ride Epona as a kid, so we can figure that out. And as a kid looking at these screenshots, I was like, well, this game looks like more Ocarina of Time. So of course it's gonna be good. Then there is the June issue. In the June issue of Nintendo Power. So remember back in the day, there was the May preview, then there was the July blowout. But in the June issue, it was kind of this gap because they would preview E3 when you'd be getting your May magazine. Then E3 would be taking place in May or in early June, so it would take a whole month for them to get the images, to get the reports, and put it back in the magazine. So, there was always kind of a lull. But in the June issue, they actually do a little thing here in Pack Watch about the Game Boy Advance, which is going to be the next generation Game Boy, which they're calling the AGB for some reason. They didn't want to call it the GBA back in the early days. What's really weird about this is it says that they demoed the GBA or the AGB. They demoed it with Yoshi's Story, and in the words are, or the article says, this tells us that the system isn't limited to recreations of Super Nintendo titles, because Yoshi's Story is really the greatest example of a game that's bigger than a Super Nintendo title. Of course, it's on the N64. So the Super Nintendo, there would be a lot of Super Nintendo games on the Game Boy Advance. Yoshi's Story would never actually come to the Game Boy Advance, probably because they didn't think it would sell that well. But yeah, we get some information here. It's going to be a 32-bit system, which was kind of misleading, because when you think of 32-bit systems, you think of the PlayStation, GBA, not a PlayStation. It could run Doom, so I guess that's something. But so comparable to the N64. It says it's comparable to the N64, and then it goes on to say that advanced games will not run on Game Boy system, because they want you to know this is a clear break from the past. Next up is Banjo-Tooie. So in the June issue, we get this spread about Banjo-Tooie. We see screenshots of Mumbo and Kazooie, presumably playable characters in this game. So that was a big deal. You can read about it, and it says that on August 28th, Banjo-Tooie is going to come out. And it didn't come out on August 28th. But assumedly, the November title for this year was going to be another rare game, either Conquer, or we'll talk about this other game in a minute. But before we get to that, here's something that's just random. An old EB Games ad for Game Boy Color, which featured Diddy Kong racing character tipped up in Diddy Kong, which is kind of random. Some of the highlighted games, Donkey Kong Country is coming out to the Game Boy Color, which is kind of a miracle port, really. Then you have Wario 3, great game. You have some NES ports of Crystalis, Warlock, and then there's that Perfect Dark. Alrighty, so now we're going to get into the July issue of Nintendo Power for July 2000. And this, as a kid, again, I'd been waiting for Conquer news forever. So I turned the page, and there, as part of the big spread, is a statue of Conquer, not wearing his blue and yellow shirt from Diddy Kong Racing and Pocket Tails, but a blue zip-up hoodie. So that was a pretty big deal. In his little blurb there is, "I'm a star." So you read here, and it talks about they're talking about how everybody's here to see PS2, Dreamcast. Those games, it basically says, oh, the PS2 didn't have a good showing, the Dreamcast didn't have a good showing, they don't even look as good as the N64 games. And then it references, hey, the Dolphin in Advance, they're locked under key. You don't need to think about those systems. You have the Nintendo 64 and the Game Boy Color. So here we have some of the announcements, some of the featured games. Remember that the announcement from 1999 that Rare was going to make Mickey Mouse games? Here's the first one, Mickey Speedway USA. And now we have Paper Mario, no longer Paper Mario Story, 2 months later. Paper Mario, we have Gold and Silver. Again, Perfect Dark GBC. They're wanting you to make that a big deal, or think that's a big deal. So then we have some of the announcements and some of the showcase games. So we see Majora's Mask, we see Banjo-Tooie, but then we see 2 new games, or really a brand new game plus a reintroduction of a game that had been bouncing around for a while. Conker's Bad Fur Day. Finally, Conker's back. But we're told in this article, and this was very, very upsetting for me, barely, I guess I was 9, I was almost 10, where it clearly, where they tell us that this game is definitely for mature audiences. But then they go on to say, Ken Lobb of Nintendo, now of Xbox, says, Conker's about getting into the next area and see what the next joke is. So, not really a way to make me think, well, this game isn't for me. Now, of course, I would find out later it wasn't for me, or wasn't really allowed to play it. Another game they announced at E3 2000 was Dinosaur Planet. Now, if you look at this image, this screenshot of this blue fox, blue cat lady, you immediately think Ocarina of Time, Jabba Jabba's Belly, where Link is using the sword to mess with Jabba's inside, the thing hanging down from the top of his throat. So clearly you see this picture and you're like, well, that just looks like Zelda, but it's a blue fox. and you see Tricky the Triceratops in the right hand corner. This blue fox. So this game immediately got my attention because at the time I wasn't thinking that looks like a ripoff. I was thinking that just looks like a fun version, a fun rare game that looks like Zelda. So Dinosaur Planet was going to be, as the text says, a Zelda-inspired adventure where you play these two foxes. And this is what's really weird. We all know this became Star Fox Adventures. We all know this became Star Fox. But they reference Star Fox in this article, not based on how the characters look, but they say there was even a part where there was a Star Fox-like battle where that pits you up against a mothership in your flying dragon. So that early on in Dinosaur Planet, early on in Star Fox Adventures, your Crystal on the back of her pterodactyl fighting one of the airships, which it plays like Star Fox. In which that's kind of juxtaposed early on in the game when you're playing the Star Fox in the R-Wing. So that was in there before. That was in there before this was a Star Fox game. So then there's a spread about Eternal Darkness, which we know that would become a Gamecube game. There's this whole introduction to Silicon Knights and how you should take them seriously. They're the next big thing. There's this interview with Mr. Miyamoto, Mr. Aonuma, who wasn't really a household name yet, but was going to direct Majora's Mask. And then you have Mr. Tezuka, who is the 2D Zelda guy, the 2D Mario guy, who at this time was helping with, and you have Tezuka who is the 2D Mario guy now, but he was really on everything back then, working on Zelda with Aonuma. So we had this spread about Majora's Mask, and then they asked Miyamoto like what he thinks about Dinosaur Planet, which we find out later. What he thought about Dinosaur Planet was they should just make that a Star Fox game, and he kind of made him do it. Okay, so you know that Nintendo always saved the big news for later in the year. So SpaceWorld, which would have been in August 24th. So the October issue of Nintendo Power is going to talk to us about the Nintendo GameCube and the Game Boy Advance. So here we have it in the October issue. As everybody else was lining up to buy their PS2s, Nintendo wanted you to buy Majora's Mask. Here is the spread about the GameCube and these infamous screenshots, videos, if you look at them online, of Link fighting Ganon. Clearly, that game never happened, right? But that would set the internet on fire because everybody's like, wow, look at what's possible. And then there's this images of Luigi's Mansion or Luigi, where it's like, hey, this is one of the 5 games that's going to be a part of the Japanese launch in July, featuring Luigi. Then there's the screenshots of Samus Aran. There hadn't been a Metroid game since 1994. Here's Samus running down this corridor. The Nintendo GameCube. You see this early prototype of the GameCube controller where the buttons are a little bit differently and the colors a little bit differently. We see this prototype of the Wavebird, which I love that color. I love that color scheme. That's really cool. We see prototypes of the Game Boy Advance that we'll talk more about on the next page. We see Meowth's Party, which was never released. It was just a tech demo. And then we get this GBA spread where Advance Wars, you have an F-Zero game, you have a Bomberman game, and so there's some early games that were released. There's Castlevania, which in Japan's called Dracula. So you have these really cool colors, really iMac-inspired colors of the Game Boy Advance. Rumor has it there was a version of Diddy Kong Racing, Diddy Kong Pilot at this SpaceWorld where Mario and the family were playable characters. That was never released, obviously. It became Banjo Pilot. So can you imagine, like, one day they announced both the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance, and that goes on the internet. Nintendo Power really didn't want you to know about the new stuff. Nintendo Power didn't really want you to know what was coming out next. But they knew they couldn't hide it from people at this point because of the internet. So here you have it in October. So before you go buy your PS2, the GameCube is coming next year. The Game Boy Advance is coming next year. They're going to connect together. They're going to link up. And then at the end of that issue, in the Pack Watch, you have this promise that the GameCube is going to have more developers than ever before on a Nintendo console. So the N64, obviously, there was very few developers outside of Nintendo making games for it. But don't worry, Dennis Dyack of Silicon Knights says that I don't think Sony and Microsoft are going to be able to keep pace with the GameCube. We are opening the doors for developers to come in. And at first, they were there. The third-party developers were there for the GameCube, but it just didn't last. So that's Nintendo news. In the year 2000, we're going to do another video about Conker from announcement in 97 to final release in 2001. But let me know if you like these videos. we'll get to Nintendo news in 2001 very soon.